Last week we had a really good Easter service last week for those of you that got to be with us. And it was a lot of fun, and it was a lot going on, and it was a good day. And just to let you know, then my wife, Karen, and Abby, shake your head at me like I'm not going to tell. Abby and Aubrey, my niece, they all took off after Easter lunch to Colorado Springs to take care of some things for Abby's final stages for college life, which is scary enough in itself that she's going to college next year. So they went over, and we're coming back on Monday night, and I got that call, that dreaded call at 11:30 at night. Been asleep for about a half an hour. I got a call, woke me up, that said, "Dad, we're okay, but they had an accident coming back from Colorado Springs." So they were just this side of Blue Mesa, probably 30 miles still or so on the other side of Montrose, and it was not. There's not good accidents, but this was not a good accident. All right, so I jump in the car and I start heading that way. Get there with my gotta get gas and everything else to get there. So I get there. They drove the minivan. Karen hit a patch of gravel in there. No deer, no ice, no excuse. Right there, okay. She hit some gravel and spun it around enough to hit the guardrail, and then spin her around back across the road. And if there would have been any incoming traffic, it would have been bad, but there's not. And hit the mountain on the other side. Okay, and so she's there with the car. It's kind of high. She can't move anywhere. She's kind of embedded in the mountain. The back window's blown out. I mean, it was a mess. The girls' seats were thrown back and turned around, and so I get there about an hour and 15 minutes or so later. By the time I get there, and the state trooper had just got there, not too much longer before I got there. The tow truck showed up about 20 minutes after I got there, and so they totaled our minivan this week. So the good news is I don't have to have a minivan anymore. All right, just saying, I can move on from the minivan finally. And they're all fine. They were hurt and beat up a little bit, but don't give Aubrey too big a hug this morning. She's still bruised up pretty good, but and Karen's got a knot on her head. It was so a fun weekend, and so just glad that they're all safe. So if you see us driving around something that's not the minivan, now you know why. All right. In fact, Karen's been driving all week the church van. She's been styling in the church van all week, and so it's been good. The big 15-passenger van. Hey, over the next couple of weeks, as we're leading into Mother's Day, which is just a reminder, men and daughters and sons, everybody, Mother's Day is just around the corner. Okay. We're gonna just kind of do a few series and culminating with Mother's Day message. But today we're going to go to Psalm 139. And again, the scriptures will be up there eventually, but if you want to get to the Bibles, we're going to be just pretty much in Psalm 139 through most of the morning. And the title today is The Power of Design, as you can see, The Power of Design. And there's a book that was written years ago by a guy named Robert Wise, and it was called Your Churning Place. I'm not sure if anybody's ever read that book. But in that book, he tells the story about Burt Lancaster. Now, how many of you guys have been Burt Lancaster fans over the years? You older, okay? None of the younger are raising their hands. They don't have a clue who he is, okay? Burt Lancaster, of course, he was a famous movie star. He made almost 100 movies between 1939 and 1989, right? A lot of movies in there. And he was very popular. He was a big deal in Hollywood. But before he began working in the movies, this is the stuff that I read about him. Burt Lancaster was a circus performer. Not sure if you guys all knew that or not, okay? It was a job he was fortunate to land, considering his less than flawless audition. All right, so he had some skills, but when he auditioned for the circus, this is what happened. He was asked to perform on the parallel bars, so he leaped up on the bars and began his routine. Because he was nervous, his timing was off, and he spun over the bar, falling flat on his face, some 10 feet below. Now, he was so humiliated that he immediately leaped back on the bar, and as he spun again in the same point, he flipped off and smashed to the ground once more. It says his tights were torn, he was cut and bleeding, he was fiercely upset, but he leaped back on the bars again. But the third time was even worse because this time he fell on his back. The circus agent finally came over, picked him up and said, "Son, if you promise not to do that again, you've got the job." All right? He was persistent, right? He was frustrated, okay? Burt Lancaster was frustrated, but he knew he could do the job. But every time he tried, he failed. A lesser man probably would have quit after the first time, right? But Lancaster was so convinced of his own abilities, his own talents, that he kept at it even when he fell down repeatedly. Now, many of the great men and women of the past, all right, have approached life in the same fashion. A couple illustrations. Henry Ford, all right, was broke at the age of 40, and yet he created the first automobile empire, right? Albert Einstein flunked in math, and yet he devised some of the most powerful math equations. One of Great Britain's, in history's great admirals, named Horatio Nelson, suffered from seasickness. All right? Helen Keller, who we've all heard about, she could not see, she could not hear, but yet she graduated with honors from Radcliffe College. Abraham Lincoln, he was well known throughout his life for his failures in business and failures in life, and yet, of course, we remember him as one of the greatest presidents we've ever had. You know, these people, like so many others, they overcame difficulties because they were convinced that they had purpose. They were convinced that they had value. They were convinced that they were designed for something better than just what than they could settle for. A purpose and a value that their handicaps could not damage or undermine. Abraham Lincoln explained the reason he was driven to accomplish so much in his life. And this is what he said. Surely God would not have created such a being as man with an ability to grasp the infinite to exist only for a day. No, man was made for immortality. So over the next few weeks, we're going to talk a little bit, and as we're working our way towards Mother's Day, we're going to just kind of go over a few, I think, very enlightening services for us and messages. And we know, guys, and if you're a mom in here, we all know that every mother thinks their kids can do anything they set their hearts on, right? I mean, they do. They encourage them to do that. They do everything to encourage them. Moms have that kind of confidence in their kids, in their children. They may not always have that same confidence in their husbands, but they have that confidence in their kids for sure, right? And because of that, I have a couple of jokes I read. All right, so here we go. All right, marriage. Marriage is a relationship in which one person is always right and the other is a husband. All right, that's just kind of the truth of the matter right there. I'm just saying. All right. There was a mom who was writing to her mother-in-law, writing a little note that said, "Dear," I won't put a name in there since my mother-in-law's sitting in here, but "Dear mother-in-law," says, "don't teach me how to handle my children. I'm living with one of yours and he needs lots of improvement." Right? Sometimes moms aren't always as confident in their husbands as they are their kids, right? Because they know that their kids are valuable and they're intelligent and they're the best looking at everything they are, because that's a mom's attitude about their children. It should be. We look in Psalm 139. We're going to see some things that David is realizing about himself. Here is David long before he's a king, long before he is one of the most powerful men in the world at that time, and he's just a shepherd boy. All right, just a teenage kid, young teenage kid, keeping watch over his dad's, his sheep, his flocks out there, and he's writing things down. And David arrived at a conclusion. And his conclusion was this: he came to believe that he has been created by God. Okay? He was created by God. They didn't have the teachings of creation and evolution, all the stuff then. No, this is David, just as a kid out there watching the sheep, and he has now been convinced something is special about who he is because of God. And he realized that he had been fearfully and wonderfully made. He realizes that God had knit him together in a very special way. I can just visualize David. I got a chance to go to Israel a few years back and got to see some of these hillsides that these shepherds were on. And I can just see him sitting on the side of a hillside, watching those sheep, keeping an eye on them, trying to protect them, but really having nothing else to do as they're grazing except to think. And I think something that he sees and hears, or something he feels, then turned his thoughts to God. And so we're going to go through 4 different points today. And the first one is this. Number 1, the what. All right? The what. So what was it exactly he was thinking about out there? Well, we go to verse 13 of Psalm 139, and this is what it says. It says, he's telling God this: "For you created my inmost being." You created that. It says, "You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you," he says, "because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well." Okay, and I don't know what exactly it was he noticed to get him to write that. Maybe he was just looking at his hands. He's out there sitting on a hillside, observing things. Maybe he just took a look at his hands, right? And notice how amazing they were. There was a doctor, Scott Carrison, years ago, who noted that hands are one of, and he says, the most intricate and beautiful parts of the human body. 19 bones arranged to do all sorts of things. They can form a cup, right? They can form an arch. They can form a flat surface. They can be balled into a fist, all with just the thought of your mind. It can do all these things. I mean, you can, fingers, they're so delicate that they can lift a needle from a table, right? Or you can open up a jar that's really hard. You can, in your pocket, you can tell the difference between a dime and a penny because they're just that sensitive, right? I mean, it's amazing to think about the hands. And he says that no engineer designing a robot hand has ever come close to such perfection as what God created just in our hands. Maybe he was just looking at his hands and realized there's something special about this, right? Or maybe he was just there and he heard a bird or something in the tree and he started thinking about his hearing, right? And he wondered about the marvel of hearing. Whitaker Chambers wrote a book where he told of sitting with his little 2-year-old daughter on his lap, and while she was sitting there, he just started looking intently at her ear. And he says he was struck by the design of that ear, how beautiful, how shell-like it was, how perfectly designed it was to catch every sound wave in the air, to then be translated into sound by the brain. And knowing something in mechanics of the ear, he began to think about it. And he was struck by how impossible it is that anything so intricate, so complex, so beautifully designed could ever occur by chance. And that then led him to other lines of thought, and eventually he began to investigate the Christian position of creation and became a believer. All because he just studied the ear, to realize how amazing that it was. Right? Or maybe David, who's not a mechanical engineer, right? He's just a shepherd this time. Maybe he thought just about his breathing. Just think about that for a second. Everybody do me a favor, okay? Everybody take a breath. Okay, now let it out. Okay, do that one more time. Let it out. Okay, third time. Ready? One more time. Take it in. Okay, let it out. Can you imagine if you had to think about doing that at all times of the day to stay alive? I mean, think about that. If we had to think about, I got to take a breath, I got to let it out. I got to take a breath, we would die, right? First of all, we have to sleep sometime. It's not going to happen, right? But no, what did God do? He created the lungs to automatically do that for us. Right? I mean, how amazing is that? And I don't know what David was thinking. I really don't. All I know is that whatever got him to thinking, it led him to realize how much he meant as an individual to God. And it caused him to probably maybe even change the future thoughts of his life, because he was, and we are, fearfully and wonderfully made. Yes, even with all of our problems that we have, and the sicknesses that we have, and the aches and pains that we have, and everything, guess what? We are fearfully and wonderfully made. God created us special. God cared for us enough and for David enough to knit him together in such an amazing and marvelous way that even David had to sit back and realize he was pretty incredible because of what God had done. And when David thought about this, he realized just how much God cared for him. And that made him realize and led him to realize that God cared so much for him that he would always be there for him. I think sometimes we forget how amazing we have been created to be. We just take things for granted. We get up, we do the necessary things to shave, to comb, to brush, to clean. We get moving, and we forget of how incredible we have been created to be. And because of that, if He cared that much to spend that much time on every minute aspect of who we have been created to be as a physical person, to know He's going to always be there for us. And that's the second point, all right, this morning. The where. All right, we looked at the what, now let's look at the where. And we're going to go still stay in Psalm 139, and let's jump to verse 7. All right? Verse 7, this is what it says. He says, this is what David says, "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence?" He says, "I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me, your right hand will hold me fast." Man, some pretty intelligent things here coming from David. David was basically visualizing the greatest distances that he could imagine, right, at this time in his life. And he looked as far as up to the heavens, as far as the heavens is, as high as that is, to the very depths that he couldn't even see, to the other side of an ocean and a sea to a place he's never even been, right? He looks at all these great distances and he realizes that it wouldn't matter. God is always going to be there. No matter where he was, God was going to be there. A writer once told of when his family was about to move. He was 12 years old. His family was getting ready to move from Minnesota to Montana. Right? And the night before they left, he said he got down by his bed and he said, "Goodbye, God. We're going to Montana." Right? Because he was convinced he was not going to find God in Montana. Right? But when he got there, of course, God was there. And then he later writes, he says, now I have found him everywhere since. Right? God is everywhere. He is at all places, no matter where we are, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, struggles, positives. He's with us and he's there through all of it. And it was thinking about how marvelously God had created him that led David to realize that God would be there for him wherever he was. And that God's love for him gave him value and gave him purpose. And I guarantee you, years later, in the midst of all the stuff that David had to go through, and running for his life at times, and trying to decide how to lead the people of Israel, in making sure, he had to look back at this and realize that there was value and purpose to how God, not how God, just how he created him, but that the fact that God was with him through all of this. And I think we need to realize sometimes that, guys, we come to church on a Sunday morning and we worship and we sing some amazing worship songs. We get to hear a message and we get to be challenged and we get to give offering. We get to do all these things. But there are people in our world who don't believe in God like we do. They don't even think God exists. Right? There are people out there who believe that man is little more than just an advanced animal. That's what we are. A complex but accidental collection of chemical interactions, right? That has no purpose, no inherent value beyond reproduction of more of those same animals. Back in 2005, Time magazine quoted the evolutionary author Robert Wright. And he was answering the questions of what makes people happy. That's the question he was asked. So this is how he answered it. Okay? He said, people so reliably pursue food and sex because eating and sex release neurochemicals that make them feel happy. And the reason that this neurochemical rule is part of the human heritage is that the genes responsible for it have understandably done well for themselves, he said. In other words, what he's saying is, we're able to be happy because our happy genes survived and excelled through evolution, right? The things that make us happy, they made it through evolution. That's why we can be happy. But if those genes hadn't made it, those genes that encourage us to eat and encourage us to reproduce, right? If they hadn't made it through that long evolutionary process, all we'd be able to do is just kind of mope around on this earth. That's it. Right? But it goes even further than that. There's another Time magazine article, and it's told of a science known as evolutionary biology. All right? And here's what this science says. The premise of this science is this: we're just human animals. That's what we are. And we can look to the realm of other animals for reasonable models for the underlying rationale for how we behave. All right? We can base how we behave on watching the animals. That's what this biology says. Okay? According to this article, it says, it is to man's, or the male's, evolutionary advantage to sow his seeds far and wide. They just naturally sleep around. That's what the article said. Men. Okay? Women, though, instead, they seek mates with the best genes and the most to invest in the offspring. And these strategies, this is what the article says, can then put the sexes in conflict and undermine love. Do you think so? Okay? And then he gives an example. These scientists point to the ape culture. It says, among the apes, the greater the difference in size between the male and the female, the less monogamous the male is. All right? If he's bigger, he's sleeping around. All right? This then forms, as they say, the basis for understanding infidelity and promiscuity in the human race. Thus understandable to a race of animals that have evolved into a present higher form. So because we're animals and we've evolved to a higher form, yet because we go back to the basis of needs, right? That's how they justify all the promiscuity and sleeping around and everything else in the world, because we're animals. We're just more evolved animals. Okay? So I can gather then from this information that without God in the picture, men and women are reduced to being selfish animals who are principally driven by their desire to reproduce and eat, right? According to this article. And if our lives were void of if our lives were void of a God opportunity for us to actually have an experience with a God, then sex and food, selfish desires, anytime and any way you want them, sounds a whole lot like living in sin to me, right? And that's the thing. The difference here between evolution and the difference between creation, there's a big difference here. The distance between those two is this. And Alan Webster, an author, put it this way. He says, evolution sees man as one step above the apes, where Scripture sees him as one step beneath the angels. Right? And I'm going to go even further. Because angels weren't created in God's image. We were. Right? So I don't think we're even a step beneath the angels. God created us in such a special way. We are unique. We're not just an animal that's evolved a little bit more than every other animal. That's baloney. Okay? That's the strongest word I can use in church, all right? That's baloney. No, we were created in God's image. And David, here is David. He's saying here, he realizes what a marvelous creation he is. He's sitting on a hillside watching his father's sheep, feeling the breeze blow over his body. He looks down at his hands and feet. He feels his heart beating. He sees his chest rise and lower with just breathing, right? And he realizes this is no accident. He is designed by God. He is fearfully and wonderfully made. And so are you. The third thing, let's look at the who. We've seen the what and the where. Let's look at the who. Right? And when we look at this, I think this point that we're going to cover, this points to one of the major characteristics of Christianity. Okay? Here it is. One of the major things that we believe in Christianity. We believe we were created by God. Okay? That changes from everything else. We believe we're created by God, created in His image. And because we've been created by God, we then can realize that we've been created for something more than just selfishness. Just to worry about me and only me and my desires and we're created to do more than that. We are made to do great things. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10. We're going to jump away from Psalm for a second. We jump to Ephesians 2:10, and here's what Paul wrote to this church at Ephesus. All right? And he's trying to encourage them, right, to realize that they are special. Okay? They are more than just what maybe the people around them have even told them. And he says this, for we are God's handiwork. Not God's accidents, not God's okay work. No, we're His handiwork, right? We're created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. You were created to do good works. That's part of who we were created to be. You go back to Burt Lancaster, right? He fell again and again and again, but he kept getting up again and again and again because he knew he was capable. Inside his heart of hearts and mind, there was this confidence of his own value, this confidence of his own abilities. But guys, even that isn't really enough for us just to make our way through life. Because there are many in our world today who would like to push the idea that if you just have the power of positive thinking, you'll be successful, right? Just think positive things. Don't think negative. Think positive, you'll be successful. And I have nothing against the power of positive thinking, all right, as far as it goes, all right? But if it's simply based upon the idea that I can because I think I can, right? Or I can have something just because I believe I can get it, it's just wishful thinking. That's all that is, right? And in reality, it's just wishful thinking. It doesn't work that way in the real world. David was a man who had positive thinking, right? He was a man of confidence. He was a man of courage. But his confidence and courage were not based on his own personal abilities and potential. And he had a bunch of potential. He had a lot of abilities. But his courage and his confidence was based upon God's power and God's grace in his life. That made the difference in who he was and who he was going to become. David was a man who was willing to face giants, right? He was a man who led his people and his nation against enemies. His confidence was based entirely upon the realization, I think it went back to this particular time. He's sitting on this mountainside, and it all goes back, this confidence, this courage, to the realization that he was created in the image of God and was special to Him. Look at again, verse 1 through 5 in Psalm 139. This is what he tells God. You have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you, Lord, know it completely. You hem me in behind and before, and you lay your hand upon me. Man, David is convinced that God is concerned about him as an individual, his life, his walk, his good, his bad, all of it, convinced. He knew God had laid his hand upon him. I think, and this was the basis of his feeling and the basis of him having purpose in his life. And we can all do that same thing, guys. God has done that for us. If we go back and read those verses, I could say this to God. You could individually say this to God. You could say, God, you have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is even on my tongue, Lord, you know it completely. You hem me in behind and before, and you lay your hands upon me. That's all. It could be all of our verses to God. And so we've looked at these. We looked at the what and the where, and I know we always think about when we look at the when, what, where, who, but I'm going to add a different one here, different W. We're going to look at the wow this morning, okay? The wow. And I've read this psalm before. I studied the book of Psalms in college, and I've read this psalm, and I've actually preached out of the psalm before. But when reading it this time to prepare for this message, I noticed something different than I've noticed before about the psalm. Something I'm not sure I've ever saw it before. And this is what I saw. That this was, and a psalm is a song to Jesus. What it is. That's what a psalm is. It's a written song to Jesus. And I don't think this is just any ordinary song that was written to God. Okay? I think this was literally a love song written to God from David. This was David declaring his undying love for his God. I think that's what he's doing. I mean, how many of you in here have ever, you don't have to raise your hand, but how many of us have ever observed a young man who's in love, right? You may have observed a young man who was in love before, and they're almost unbearable, right? I have 3 teenage daughters, all right, and love from a boy, it's not good anyway, but it's just almost gross to watch sometimes, right? But the thing was, I was that young guy back in the late 80s, right? I met this girl and I fell in love and I fell hard for this girl. I mean, I couldn't think of anything but that girl. I talked about her all the time. I wanted to be with her every chance I got. I'd go on a date, and when I got back to my room, my dorm room, after a date with her, I would look back and I would rack my brain to make sure that I hadn't done or said something so stupid at the date that she wouldn't have anything to do with me again, I was head over heels with her. And when you're around such a young man, you sense that he realizes just how much he has and how lost he'd be without this girl, right? And I'll be married to that girl for 25 years next month, right? Right back there. Yeah. But there's just this love. There's this way that they walk, that they talk, they look. It's just completely different. And guys, that's how David's coming across in this psalm to me. He is so in love with God. He's so blown away by God loving him. That he doesn't know how to express himself. And so he's doing everything he can. It's a lover's poem. This is an expression of adoration for God. It's what it is. And he focuses the bulk of this song on proclaiming just how much God has done for him and praising him for it and loving him for it. And then David goes to great lengths then to express that he loves what God loves, but he also is going to hate what God hates. And this is how he ends the psalm, attempting to make sure that his heart is completely focused on God, completely focused on his ways. This is how he ends the psalm in verse 23. He says, Search me, God, know my heart, test me, and know my anxious thoughts. He then says, See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. He says, Search me out, God, know me. Man, check out my thoughts. Make sure that I am focused on you and only you. In fact, twice in those 2 verses, he asks God to examine his heart, right? To make sure it's clean. To make sure it's acceptable to him. Nothing in David's life matters to him nearly as much as God matters to him. He is hopelessly in love with God. And he wants everybody around him to know it. And that's why the Bible tells us that David was a man after God's own heart. He was that much in love with God. You know, and I don't know about you, but I want to get to that place. I want to get to that place in my relationship with God where I get to the point where all I seem to be able to talk about is God in my life. I want to get to the point where I am so taken by God that people just know how much I love Him. I want to get to the point where in everything I do, I ask whether or not it pleases God before I do it. See, people in love, when they're in love with one another, that's what they do. They're vulnerable with one another, right? They're honest with one another because they trust in each other's love for them. A man or a woman in love is a driven individual. They'll do anything to please the one that they love. And they act like that because they sense that the one they love also loves them. And I'm telling you, it's when we truly realize how much God cares for us and loves us that then our lives will take on new meaning and new purpose. Ben Hooper, who was twice elected as the governor of Tennessee, he tells the story about his childhood. This is what he said. He said, "My mother wasn't married when I was born. When I started to school, my classmates had a name for me, and it wasn't a very nice name. I used to go off by myself both at recess and during lunchtime because of the taunts of my playmates, which cut me deeply. What was worse was going downtown on Saturday afternoon and feeling every eye burning a hole through you. They were all wondering who my real father was." He then says, "When I was about 12, a new preacher came to our church. I would always go in late and slip out early, but one day the preacher said the benediction so fast I got caught and had to walk out with the crowd. He said I could feel every eye in church on me. Just about the time I got to the door, I looked up and the preacher was looking right at me. 'Who are you, son? Whose boy are you?' He said I felt the old weight come upon me. It was like a big black cloud. Even the preacher was putting me down, I thought. But as the preacher looked down at me, studying my face, he began a big smile of recognition. 'Wait a minute,' he said. 'I know who you are. I see the family resemblance. You are a son of God.' With that," Ben says, "he slapped me across the back and said, 'Boy, you've got a great inheritance. Go and claim it.' That," Ben Hooper said, "was the most important single sentence anyone had ever said to me." And with Christ's help, Ben Hooper, he had overcome his sense of rejection, overcome his sense of inadequacy, and claimed the inheritance as a child of God and went on to be a success. Why? Because somebody reminded him whose child he really was, who really loved him. And what about us this morning? What about you this morning? Can you accept that kind of love from God, to be a child of God, to be creation of God in His image? Can you love Him back in that manner? You have been amazingly designed by God, created wonderfully by God, knit together by God. All our flaws, it's all been knit together to fulfill a purpose for God, right? We are amazingly designed to be who you are. And He loves you with an unending, unexplainable, unearnable kind of love. More than any mom can love her kids. More than any husband can love his wife, or wife her husband, or kids love their parents. He loves us with a love that cannot even be compared. And yet He loves us so much that He created us to be who we are. And sometimes I think we have to claim that. We don't claim that enough. Sometimes we have to just allow God to love us, even when we think we're unlovable. Sometimes we need to allow God to love us in a way that He wants to love us. Sometimes we stand back and say, "Okay, God, that's a little bit too much love for me, because it makes me feel awkward. I have to do things." We need to allow God to love us the way He wants to love us. Guys, He sent His only Son to die on the cross for us because He loved us so much. That is a love that is hard, I can't fathom in my finite brain, right? So this morning, we're going to do this. In fact, if you would do me a favor, if you bow your head and close your eyes, if you would. I'm going to have the worship team coming back up. And this is what I